it's easy for us right now to focus on Alabama because there's so much going on there with a new staff for the first time in 17 years, with all of the portal moves, Caleb Downs, Caden Proctor, all those, brand names. I mean, household names that are leaving Alabama and all the things going on in Alabama. But I think with every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. I'm not sure what the actual verbiage is there. Bottom line, there's a ripple effect here from Nick Saban retiring. And we've seen it with different jobs across the college football landscape. We saw it at the Washington job, the Arizona job. But I think it's interesting here to look at who's impacted when it comes to playing on the field against Alabama. Who are the teams that may have the most impacted ripple effect by Nick Saban's retirement? I want to talk about those teams right now. Make sure you're subscribed right here. College football every day. We appreciate y'all so much for that. Alabama fans, Georgia fans, Auburn fans. If you're a fan of college football, this is your show. This is your channel. So make sure you're subscribed. We appreciate y'all so much for that, man. Ripple effect season is in full effect. Let's talk about the teams that are going to be impacted by Nick Saban's retirement. I think Georgia has to be the school that you look at first when you talk about who has the most opportunity with Nick Saban retiring. Because Georgia, every single year, when you had your preseason meeting and you talked about what you wanted to accomplish, I'm sure it read something like win the SEC, win the national championship. Those are probably two goals that are listed for Georgia in the preseason. Well, if you wanted to win the SEC, more than likely at some point in time, you had to go through Nick Saban's Alabama team, the greatest of all time. Well, now we see Alabama trying to collect themselves a little bit by nature of what's going on in the portal, by nature of them having a new head coach for the first time in 17 years. Who's Georgia's toughest competition going to be? Is it Alabama? If it is, it's a different version of what we saw last year, which, again, I think it might take a second for them to get collected. Is it Texas? And Texas is a great team. I mean, they made the college football playoff last year, but they lose some key pieces. It's their first year in the SEC. How do they respond to that? I think if you're Georgia, you got to feel like that final boss level that has been there for the last 17 years. If you wanted to win the conference, and in a lot of ways, winning the conference meant making the college football playoff more often than not and then competing for a national championship, which is what they expect in Athens. If you're Georgia, you don't have to play that boss level anymore. Now, you still have to compete against somebody in the SEC championship if you're going to get there. And it's not going to get a whole lot easier, but you still, the climate's still difficult being in the SEC, but not having to play Alabama that final week of, not the regular season, that first weekend, rather, of December, final week before the college football playoff, final game before you if you're Georgia, has to be pretty nice. So with that, I would say there's great opportunity, but with great opportunity comes great pressure. Much like Uncle Ben told Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. With great opportunity becomes great pressure for Georgia, because now the excuses you can make, and Georgia's not one to make excuses, but you have to believe, like, now the expectation for Georgia, they were already preseason national championship favorites in Vegas with no Nick Saban. If you're a Georgia fan, you're saying, why can't we? What's standing in our way? A team that's their first year in the SEC? Lane Kiffin, who's poured in an entire team? Who is it? LSU? We don't even know what they're going to be. They just lost their Heisman Trophy quarterback. I'm speaking from the perspective, if you're a Georgia fan, that's how you would feel. So the pressure is obviously immense, but it always is in Georgia, and they are obviously going to be impacted by the ripple effect of no more Nick Saban. To me, it means no more boss level for them to play when it comes to the SEC. Now, staying in the SEC, anytime the greatest coach of all time retires, it's going to impact your rival. And I think for Auburn, the ripple effect for them is twofold. Like, now the ammo you have on the recruiting trail, I think, is real. Hugh Freeze was already a dog on the recruiting trail. He's already been recruiting his tail off since he's been on the Plains. But we see it a lot, man. Like, Auburn and Alabama, they go toe-to-toe a fair amount for prospects. Now, if you're Hugh Freeze, and they're not into negative recruiting, but you'd have to imagine if you're a prospect, you can't help but feel like, well, what's Alabama going to be? Let's say it does take Kalen DeBoer a year or two to get it off the ground. And some of those recruiting battles that Auburn and Alabama are going back and forth on, they start to favor Auburn a couple times in a row. They start to get more and more talent. And that's the recruiting side of things. I'm not even talking about what's going to happen on the field. Because on the field, you have to feel like if you're Auburn, that door to win some Iron Bowls is propped pretty firmly open. And the Iron Bowl is weird to begin with. It took a 4th and 31 conversion for a touchdown from Jalen Milroe to Isaiah Bond to beat you, to be honest. So you kind of feel like you're in that discussion regardless. But if you start winning some Iron Bowls, let's say you win 2 in a row, think about the approval rating for Hugh Freeze. Think about the confidence boost that is for your team if you start owning that rivalry a couple years in a row. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I am saying the ripple effect and the same thing we just said for Georgia, the opportunity for Auburn, for them to really make some noise here as Alabama's kind of collecting themselves for the first time in almost 2 decades, that would be a story you would like to tell if you're Auburn. So that definitely is going to impact them in a major, major way. One more team in the SEC I want to talk about here, Ole Miss. And you hear Ole Miss and you're like, yeah, I guess, but JD, there's no more divisions. Like, they don't have to get through Alabama if they want to make it to the SEC championship, on paper at least, in terms of winning their division. And that's true. But for Ole Miss, man, like, they've always kind of been in that, I say always, relative, in recent memory, since Lane Kiffin's been there, they've always kind of been in that 3rd place in the SEC, that 4th place in the SEC, that team that's challenging in the SEC, but they never really made it to Atlanta under Lane Kiffin. But now, you see Lane Kiffin and what he's doing through the portal, they are in full-on ascent mode. Adding guys like Walter Nolan, adding guys like Princely Umanmielen, adding guys like Juice Wells. So they're upping the roster level quite a bit, as they tend to do in Oxford, Mississippi. And you bring some key pieces back like Trey Harris, like Jackson Dart. Ole Miss, make no mistake about it, they are pushing to be a Tier 1 SEC team. They're not settling for 3rd place on the podium anymore. They're trying to go for gold. And so to have that be the direction Ole Miss is heading with some very real momentum coming off a New Year's Six Bowl and a double-digit win season, and then you look at the other side of things for Alabama, who's stood in the way of that pretty frequently, who's occupied one of those top spots on the podium in the SEC, and they're for the first time, again, in around 2 decades, taking a step backwards, in theory, at least on paper from a roster perspective. Like, that's massive. That is absolutely massive for Ole Miss. It feels like there's a spot open on the podium, and Ole Miss is doing everything in their power to do it. And I know the playoffs expanding. I know the SEC is changing. And so there's probably more opportunity by nature of college football changing as a whole. But for Ole Miss, man, the way they're trending right now, if they're able to kind of get in that top spot, and let's say that they kind of get in that top spot and stay in that top spot for a year or two, what happens to Ole Miss and what happens to Lane Kiffin? Do they start recruiting even better at the high school level? Because typically they live in like that teens or 20s range, does Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin. What happens if they get that cooking and they attack the portal and they keep winning football games? Like, this whole thing could snowball pretty quickly, in my opinion, for Coach Kiffin and Ole Miss with this this transition period in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Massive ripple effect there. Now, like I said, went on Feinbaum yesterday, and one of y'all got at me on Instagram, at JD Piquel. We appreciate y'all doing that, and was just right away like, JD, how could you not mention Florida State as being a team that was impacted by Nick Saban's retirement? And at first I was like, what are we talking about here? But then it started to dawn on me. Florida State, it's hard to say they haven't benefited from the Bama portal exodus by virtue of Nick Saban's retirement, because they have 5 players currently via the portal committed to them from Alabama. So, like, if anything, you're adding your talent level by nature of the portal. But on top of that, like, let's talk about Alabama overall as a roster. Like, you don't play at Alabama if you're a scrub. I said it previously, I'll say it again. Nothing but top 2 classes really since 2020 on that roster. And I say since 2020 because that's probably the most useful window of time to utilize for this conversation. Like, a lot of top 5 or a lot of 4 and 5 star players on that roster. And some of those elite players are making their way to Tallahassee. So looking at Florida State and how they're also impacted by the Saban ripple effect, like the transfer portal for Florida State, we talked about it yesterday. They don't just use it as like a self-preservation tool. Hey, we want to patch some holes here, patch some gaps there. And they do use it for that to some degree. But like, it's not just a saving grace for Florida State. It's a full-on weapon for them. Like, they have shown now they are good at the portal. They have the resources to be good at the portal. They evaluate the portal well, and they're going to utilize the portal. And so for Alabama having guys hit the portal, and for Florida State being able to take some of those players, they're saying, okay, you're going to give us more ammunition to up our roster level, talent level rather. We're going to use that. So massive benefit for Florida State so far, if for nothing else, just from a sheer numbers perspective. At last check, Florida State had 14 transfers in Tallahassee, 5 of those guys from Tuscaloosa. So Mike Norvell and company are definitely reaping the benefits of Nick Saban stepping away and from Alabama having some movement on their roster. Hey y'all, thanks so much for watching. Subscribe to the channel here to make sure you don't miss an episode of The Hard Count. Also be sure to check out other videos on the On3 YouTube channel.